Thank you, Mrs. Pébernes. Good morning. My name is Patrick Parent. I'll be the timekeeper today and also a facilitator at some of the sessions of today's event. I'm the senior advisor to the chair of H3C, and I'm also a former market regulator and auditor. We will start today with the first session dealing with audit standards and other guidance that has been provided on joint audit. Jacques Etévenin, who is a member of the board of H3C, also the chair of the commission in charge of establishing auditing standards in France, and a member of the International Monetary Fund External Audit Committee, and former deputy finance director of the Air Liquide Group, will be the facilitator for this first session. We'll have contributions from Ms. Valia Jordanova, who is head of the Advisory Council on Auditing to CIPOSA. CIPOSA is the audit regulator in Bulgaria. Ms. Jordanova is a certified public accountant and registered auditor and a member of the Institute of Certified Public Accountant in Bulgaria. She is also the chairwoman of the Advisory Audit Council to CIPOSA. And Ms. Jordanova has been involved in the development of the Joint Audit Guidance Statement of CIPOSA and ICPA in Bulgaria as a project coordinator. We will also have the contribution from Jan Mtega, who's a professional manager of standards at IRBA. IRBA is the Independent Regulatory Board of South Africa, the audit regulator of this country. And we will also have contributions from Marjolaine Dobladeau, who is director of the international division of the French audit regulator, H3C. In the interest of time, I will...
Excuse me, I can't hear.
Ms. Jordanova? Can you...
I'm very sorry, I can't hear.
Okay, we'll try to fix that.
Okay.
Jacques, I give you the floor.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick. Good morning to all of you. For me, it's a great pleasure to moderate this panel on audit standards and other guidance. We will make you the technical presentation on joint audit with the experience of 3 countries. So the purpose is to explain how joint audit works in those countries and also to compare and to identify similarities and differences. So maybe to start, I'll ask to the panelists, the distinguished panelists, 3 questions about the rules managing joint audits. Question number 1 is joint audit mandatory or optional? Question number 2, what is the scope of joint audit? Does it concern only listed quantities, specific financial entities? And does it concern all financial statements published by a company or only parts of those financial statements? So maybe, Valia, could you start for Bulgaria to answer to those 3 questions, please?
Good morning, everyone. It's a huge pleasure for me to be able to present Bulgarians' experience in the field of application of the joint audit. Even more so because we are one of the few countries in the European Union that have taken such a step so far. Joint audit was introduced in 2017 together with other significant amendments in our Independent Financial Audit Act to adopt the Audit Directive from 2014 and the Regulation 537. So far, the joint audit is limited to only 3 types of entities in Bulgaria. It is mandatory for the statutory audit of the separate and consolidated financial statements of banks, insurance companies, and pension companies and funds. However, it's not mandatory for the statutory audit of the separate financial statements of their subsidiaries and associates. Joint audit is not mandatory in Bulgaria for the statutory audit of the annual financial statements of listed companies.
Thank you, Valia. What about France, Marjolaine?
Yes, thank you for giving me the floor. So in France, joint audit is in place for longer because it has been introduced in 1966. Nowadays, it is compulsory for some entities only. It is required for those entities who publish consolidated financial statements. So it's not a question of being listed or not, it's a question of establishing and being required to establish consolidated financial statements. There are also some provisions that are specifically applicable to credit institutions. So unless the credit institution is under a certain threshold, all credit institutions are also required to have joint auditors. So as was mentioned, indeed, I think it's the same in Bulgaria. It's the entity at the top of the group who has to appoint 2 auditors at least, which means that the subsidiaries have not this request to have 2 auditors. It's the entity which publishes the consolidated financial statement, which has 2 auditors. And then regarding the question whether it's the individual accounts or the consolidated accounts, it's the entity who has 2 auditors. So both the opinion on the individual accounts and the opinion on the financial consolidated accounts are co-signed by 2 auditors. I think I covered a bit the general picture. Maybe over to Jan now.
So Jan, what about South Africa, please?
Thank you, colleagues, and good morning. So from our perspective within the South African environment, the joint audit is not mandatory. What happens is the regulator of the banks, of the South African Reserve Bank, issues a directive or an instruction, so to say, on an annual basis, requesting the big banks to have joint auditors as their auditors from each financial period. In the old days, it used to be in the Banks Act, but that was removed. So now it's at the discretion of the regulator, so to speak, the banks regulator. And then in addition to that, we do have currently a discussion around making a similar requirement where the regulator issues instruction for the insurance companies, so for our big financial services companies. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jan. So we've got an overall picture about the scope of joint audit, what type of companies are concerned in the different countries. But there is a main question that we need to ask: what is a joint audit? Then maybe Jan, could you broadly explain how a joint audit is structured in principles, just the principles, and we'll go into more detail later on, but in principles in South Africa. And maybe then I will ask Valia and Marjolaine to explain, based on what you will have said, the differences in Bulgaria and in France. So what are the principles and how are they stated, in the standards?
Thank you so much. So yes, in South Africa, as you know, we adopt the international auditing standards. So that's the principle that we use in terms of performing any audit. So when it comes specifically to the issue of the joint audits, then if I start at the end in terms of the audit report, what happens is there's one audit report signed jointly by the joint auditors. So that's the end goal. To arrive to that end goal, we expect the joint auditors to work in tandem and go through the standards in terms of acceptance, the performance of the procedures, concluding jointly as they go through that process to arrive at that joint audit report that they will issue at the end. I'm not sure whether there's any additional aspects you want me to cover.
Jan, is there guidance? Are there specific auditing standards in South Africa? A book, rules stating how the auditors should interact together to arrive to the joint opinion?
100%. So using the ISAs as the benchmark, we do have a guide which we issued in August 2020, which helps the auditors to essentially, because remember the ISAs don't cover joint audits in detail, so then the guide helps our auditors to practically put into practice what the ISAs are saying in relation to a joint audit, because the ISAs are written for a single auditor engagement.
But does it mean that it's just how you apply ISAs in a joint audit structure? That's basically what you've developed in South Africa?
Yes, at this stage, because of the fact that the joint audit is not sitting in any legal requirement, the only place we could use is we needed to stick to the ISAs. So we use the ISAs and we practically show the auditors how they can comply with the ISAs in doing a joint audit engagement, 100%.
Okay. In Bulgaria, Valia, do you have specific auditing standards explaining the rules to follow in a case of a joint audit?
Well, in Bulgaria, we have similar concept of joint audit. In fact, we also introduced this in Bulgaria as national standards since 2003. And 2007, when the joint audit was introduced for the first time, the oversight body, Commission, and the Institute of Certified Public Accountants, we set up a work group and, in fact, surveyed the experience in other countries, mainly France and Singapore. And based on this, we developed a joint document, a joint audit statement. In addition, in fact, the document focuses on the organization and approach in the work of the joint auditors, and not on the methodology, because we apply ISAs in Bulgaria, and also it focuses on the communication between the joint auditors and the regulators.
Thank you, Valia. Marjolaine, maybe can you comment on what we do in France?
Yeah, in France, maybe what's important to note is that the two auditors form part of a college and act together as the statutory auditor of the company. So they should apply together the provisions of the national standards that are applicable for each and every audit. But in addition to that, there is a specific standard which deals with the distribution of the work between the joint auditors and explains how they should act together. The principle is that the standards apply to the college, and the specific standards explains how the work shall be distributed. This is also something that is foreseen by the law directly. There is a provision in the law referring to the fact that there is this standard which governs the way to carry out the assignment in this specific format, which is the joint audit format. But in the end, all the provisions of the national framework shall be applied by both auditors together in a way that is distributed according to the provisions of the national standards. And indeed, as was mentioned by your colleague from Bulgaria, we had some interaction with Bulgaria at the time to inform about how the distribution of work was performed in France.
Very clear. Thank you, Marjolaine. So if there are standards, it means there is role and responsibilities of joint auditors. So I'd like to, to understand, how the joint audit is organized between the two auditors, and what is the role, what is the split of the work, is it a 50-50? Is it, certain in a consolidated group, certain subsidiaries and others done by the other auditor, or is it purely, totally joint work? So that would be my first question. And relating to that, if one of the, what are the responsibilities of the auditors vis-à-vis the management of a company, vis-à-vis the shareholders? Is it a joint responsibility? Is it a split responsibility? And what happens in case one of the auditors does not perform a good job? One does a very good job, the other one does not. What happens? So could you maybe, Valia, maybe let us start with Bulgaria, explain how all the role and responsibilities are organized in the joint audit?
In fact, one of the most valuable feature of joint audit in Bulgaria is the joint and several responsibility for the audit, which means that each joint auditor is jointly and severally responsible for the audit performed together with other joint auditor. As well as for the auditor's opinion on the audited financial statements. Each auditor is responsible for the work of the other joint auditor and cannot claim limited liability due to the negligence or low quality of the work performed by the other auditor. Also, in our legislation, we have a specific joint auditor selection criteria, and these criteria were developed and introduced by the respective regulator. In addition, each joint auditor must possess the appropriate and required by the respective regulator competence, specific knowledge, experience, and also resources. And in this statement issued by the Commission, it stated that joint efforts for cooperation and non-restricted access to the audit documentation of the other joint auditor are required. If we have to summarize, in fact, it's a really joint work, shared work, and joint work at the phase of planning, acceptance of the audit engagement and audited entity, and at the phase of completion. So the joint auditors has to do jointly the work, starting from the individual or joint submission of an audit proposal. So it means that in Bulgaria, both approaches are possible: individual participation in the tenders, or jointly the two auditors. And then jointly responsibility for observing the statutory independence requirements and other requirements and restrictions by our audit legislation in Bulgaria. They have to coordinate the procedures and they have joint responsibility for acceptance and assessment of the audit client, audit engagement, and they have to sign a joint engagement letter. So for the areas like planning, risk assessment, significant matters, both the joint auditors are responsible to get participation. In fact, only on at the stage of execution, we have share of work. So it means that we have allocation the work between the two auditors, but in our guidelines, the Commission, in fact, introduced a certain proportion limit between the two auditors for the significant risk, 60 to 40. And in fact, finally on the completion session, so they need to assess all conclusions and final results and evidence together and to reach joint auditor's opinion and to sign a joint auditor's report.
Valia, just a question. If there's a disagreement between the two auditors on the opinion, what happens?
In fact, we have no such case up to now in Bulgaria, but in our legislation and in the guidelines they allow a situation of differences in opinion, and there are some requirements for necessary steps like early identification of differences of opinion, procedure for dispute resolution, communication regarding contentious matters with the management and with the audit committee of the audited entities. But if finally there is a disagreement, so according to our Audit Act, in the auditor's opinion, in the auditor's report, each of the two auditors should state their opinion and arguments thereon provided by each of these two auditors in a separate paragraphs. So finally, they have to issue a joint report with a separate paragraphs.
Based on what Valia has told us, I see there are a lot of, we see the contacts which existed a few years ago between France and Bulgaria, because we see a lot of similarities between what you have said and what happens in France. But maybe Marjolaine, can you comment about maybe some differences which exist in France compared to what Valia has told us?
Yes, sure. Yes, I think indeed. In the end, the same results is expected, meaning that there is only one report. So the idea is that the two auditors sign the same opinion, not going directly into any difficulty or conciliation need, and if there is a difference in view, which is not, I would say, the main situation or the one that is the most seen. But indeed, in our national standard in France, there are also some provisions for potential conciliation between the two auditors. The idea is really that they are able in the end to sign the same opinion. So if we go back to the main provisions, what is interesting in the standard is that there are a number of elements that have to be performed by each of the auditors in order to be able to form his opinion on the financial statement taken as a whole. It's not a question to have only an opinion on certain areas of the audit. No, in the end, the auditor should have the global picture and be able to participate fully and take responsibility indeed for the final report. So what are the work elements that should be done by each of the auditors? It's first understanding the entity, Each auditor shall have the complete understanding of the audited entity. He shall be also able to assess the risk and to assess materiality in order to come up with an audit plan that is agreed and that is decided together by both auditors. So the joint audit plan is discussed and agreed, of course, together by the joint auditors. And then what is split, and I think Valia mentioned it's the same for Bulgaria, then the field work can be divided between the auditors. It's not a question that all the elements are audited twice. No, of course, the work is split, and the results of the procedures are in the file of the auditor. And after that, there is the need for a cross-review. So the cross-review is an important aspect where one auditor that has not directly performed the fieldwork can have a look and review the conclusions of the other auditor. And so in the end, each of the auditor has the complete picture and knows exactly what has been done on each section of the work.
We'll address maybe this question a bit later. We are more just on the question of engagement, and how it is organized. Jan, based on what you've heard for Bulgaria and for France, do you have major differences in South Africa and how the joint audit is organized between the two auditors?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, from what my colleagues have stated thus far, there's quite a lot of similarities. So for the South African environment, again, similar to what the colleague said, a joint auditor has a joint responsibility with the other joint auditors for the audit and the other joint auditor's opinion that is expressed by them on the audited financial statement. So everything is you almost look at it, my colleague Marjolin used a very nice word earlier on college. You look at it almost like a college, even though it's two different firms or more than one firm. But when they do the work together, you look at them as one. So that's the joint responsibility. A joint auditor's joint responsibility means that the joint auditor is also responsible for the work performed by the other joint auditors. And they shall therefore jointly ensure that the joint audit engagement is conducted in accordance with the ISAs or the International Auditing Standards, and that sufficient and appropriate audit evidence which you can evidence through cross-review is obtained and documented collectively by all the joint auditors in order to express the joint auditor's opinion. So that, in practicality, that means you have this scenario where the documentation is sitting in two different audit files, electronic audit files in one firm and the other firm, but together, then that's the entire file for that particular joint audit engagement. So in our guide that we issued in 2020, in August 2020, we gave guidance to the auditors to say, because the mechanics, how you actually apply the ISAs is a bit difficult, we propose that the auditors then have a joint auditors agreement. So in other words, between the auditors themselves, they must have a contract, and that contract will cover some of the things that my colleagues were speaking about. So the contract between the auditors themselves will cover the policies to be applied in respect of independence and or compliance with the relevant ethical requirements, agreements on monitoring arrangements, agreement on group audit arrangements, who's going to audit which entities, which subsidiaries, although you do, the cross reviews, etc. Arrangements for relevant joint induction and training of the teams coming from both all the joint auditors, the joint auditors' respective roles and responsibilities with regard to the joint audit. So the roles and responsibilities then will be covered in the joint, in the agreement between the joint auditors. So those are some of the things that we put forward there, as well as one important aspect which Marjolin also spoke to a little bit earlier on, the allocation of the work. So the allocation of the work to each joint auditor will then be covered in the agreement between the joint auditors. Thank you, Chair.
Jan, can you have an imbalance between the work of the two auditors, or should it be a 50-50 allocation of the work?
So in terms of how we have drafted it, you can have a scenario, because when we discussed it in drafting our guidance, we thought it's very difficult to have a 50-50 split. So you might have an imbalance, but the check is the cross review. So even if one is doing a little bit more work, the other one still has to cross review, and that's how we are comfortable that both of them are able to sign off as the joint auditors on the joint auditors report.
But the imbalance is marginal, you say, if I understand well. It couldn't be 90-10, for example. It could be 60-40 or... Okay. I'd like to...
100%.
Okay. I'd like to pursue on the point that Jan has already addressed about the formal agreement between auditors. So I will ask Valia and Marjolaine how it is done in Bulgaria and France. But I've got also a question to Jan before we go to Valia and Marjolaine. The agreement between auditors is the company, the company which is audited, is it aware of the components of the agreement between the two auditors? The split
Yes,
of work,
so
who does what, how the audit organized, is it shared with the company which is audited?
Yes, 100%. Usually, most of the times, the company, the management of the company gets involved in the allocation, but to manage the actual audit work, then the two auditors will also need to have that mutual understanding or agreement between themselves to ensure that the work is done, simultaneously as well as in a synchronized manner. Thanks, Chair.
Just and after that, I'll pass to Valia. In the split of work, is there any obligation of rotating the work from one year to another, or are the auditors completely free, basically, to continue to audit the same components of the accounts of the same subsidiaries, or is there any obligation in the organization of the work then to change 1 year after another one?
100%. Very good question, Chair. So in our respect, we don't have a mandatory requirement, but we do have a suggestion in the guide that they must rotate the work amongst themselves from 1 year to the next. And then we also do put a suggestion for the management of the entity also to request that there's a rotation, because I think it's better that you have different eyes looking at the actual work, although you still have the cross review that will happen at some stage between the joint auditors. Thank you, Chair. Okay.
So Valia, can you comment about the engagement letter, the negotiation of the engagement letter, between auditors and maybe the company in Bulgaria?
Well, in Bulgaria, we have a joint engagement letter assigned between the joint auditors and the audited entity. We have no such practice to sign a formal contract between the two joint auditors, so there is no such practice. In fact, the organization of the work between the two auditors is based on the internal communication, because in our guidelines, they are mandatory requirement for joint development and approval of the overall audit strategy, audit plan, also assessment of independence. So we have to have a joint common materiality level, common threshold for uncorrected misstatements, and also a common understanding and approval of all audit samples. So, in fact, this allocation of the work between the two joint auditors has to be presented and approved by the audit committee. Also, this allocation is communicated with the management of the audited entity. And in fact, the audit committee, this is the body which in fact controls the proper allocation between the two auditors, the necessity of some rotation, which is not mandatory in Bulgaria. Of course, that's why the focus on the cross review between the two auditors, and also the exchange of working papers. Somehow this is also encouraged between the joint auditors.
Marjolaine, for France?
I think one of the aspects that would need to be underlined here is that the engagement in France is for 6 years, meaning that indeed in France an auditor is appointed for 6 years. He is appointed as auditor, not necessarily as joint auditor, because for instance, if you have a company which at some point in time has the obligation to establish consolidated financial statements, then it can be that there is already an auditor in place and that the company will appoint a second joint auditor. So it's the company who will then select the pair, because there will already be one auditor in place and another joining with a specific engagement in this regard. So there is not any provision requiring a joint engagement letter. So that's the responsibility of each of the auditors. But of course, in order to be able to indicate which will be the level of engagement, which will be the work that will be performed, etc. There need to be coordination beforehand between the auditors. There is another point that you mentioned, Jacques, about the rotation of the work and the distribution of the work over the years. Indeed, with this engagement lasting 6 years, over the years there is a possibility for auditors to switch and to take other areas of the audit under their scrutiny for the field work. So the idea is really over this 6-year period that there is a possibility for the auditors to change the topics on which they will be more specifically involved for the field work.
Thank you, Marjolaine. We've already touched the subject. It's about review of the work done by the other auditor. What happens if one auditor sees that the work performed by the other auditor does not seem sufficient for him? And so maybe he considers that one auditor considers that additional work should be performed. Is there any rule to follow for this, or is it just a question of discussion between the two auditors? Jan.
Thank you, Chair. So in totality, it's essentially a discussion that should happen between the two auditors. But the principle that we use for our purposes is that the joint audit report must be jointly signed. So that's the responsibility we allocate to them. How they do it amongst themselves, we give them a bit leeway how they make their arrangements. So in that particular instance, what would happen is the joint auditor that is not happy with the other joint auditor's work would probably request that joint auditor to either do additional work or redo some of the work, so you can either review or cross-review. If the other joint auditor refuses, then the one joint auditor can perhaps do the work himself or herself. And then alternatively, if there's still a dispute, then you will have to go to that agreement between the auditors that I spoke about earlier on. Then in there, you will have a dispute resolution as to how you resolve those differences on how the procedures were conducted or the samples were performed, so to speak. Thank you, Chair.
Is the company, if there is such a dispute between auditors, is the company, or the audit committee of the company, are they involved or not? Or is it a question of just the agreement between the two auditors?
Yes, when we discussed it in drafting the guide, we thought if it gets to the audit committee, then you probably go into the scenario where it's no longer a joint auditor's report anymore. You get into the scenario where maybe the audit report now they want to issue different audit reports. So in our thinking is that the dispute should be able to be resolved between the auditors themselves, and then if you can't, then you go to management. And then the audit committee for us was, in our thinking, it should be a last resort. Because for us, when you get to the audit committee, we're probably speaking about split opinions, those kind of things. And then that's no longer a joint audit report for our purposes. Then you're actually almost going into a single auditor report, so to speak. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. Valia, on your side?
Well, our practice is very similar. In fact, if as a result of the cross-review of the work performed by the other joint auditor, The other auditor concluded that the sufficiency and appropriateness of the audit events are not enough. So they have to have internal communication, and the joint auditor has to recommend for some additional work to be done. But if the other joint auditor refuses, so in our guidelines, we recommended that the other auditors has to perform the additional work. Of course, it's a matter of their internal communication and decision to address this problem, to the audit committee. It's not a practice to be discussed with the management of the audited entity.
Okay. Marjolaine?
Yeah, for France, indeed, the cross reviews allows to make sure that the work that was planned at the beginning has been carried out, and that there are not surprises that need to be addressed. And the idea behind the cross review is that each auditor is comfortable with the work that has been done. And indeed, there are some provisions specifically in the standard dealing with the fact that if after the cross review there is the idea coming through that the work is not sufficient, then there is a consultation between both auditors, and they define together which additional work need to be performed. So the idea is really that there is this discussion, this collegiality to decide what needs to be done further. But as a principle, we hope that the first plan was a good one, and that it has been carried forward correctly, and that the evidence is there. So in bad situation, of course, there need to be some refining of the work, but that has to be done together. And as is important to note, it's in the end the collective opinion of both of the auditors, so they should both be comfortable. So after discussion, the work needs to be done and then distributed again amongst both auditors.
There are two other topics I would like to cover, before the end of this session, and maybe give us some time at the end for questions. So two topics that maybe we'll try to cover a bit quickly. First is documentation. What are the rules for that the auditors have to follow to justify that the work has been performed and that the joint auditor has also performed the work he was supposed to perform? Does it mean that, and in case of a control by the regulator about the quality of the audit, does it mean that there is a duplication of all the files? Or does it mean that auditors have only to keep the files on the work they've performed, and the joint auditor keeps his own files, and there is just documentation on the cross reviews? Could you just explain what are the rules for documentation? Valia, maybe could you start this time?
In Bulgaria, in fact, each joint auditor must have their own complete audit file, which is in accordance with the requirement of our audit legislation and the applicable auditing standards, which are ISOs, and of course their own internal methodology and policies. In fact, in this audit file, the audit file should include documents on the cross review, reviews between the two joint auditors, as well as all other joint documents regarding the key matters in which the joint auditors have made their joint assessments, judgments, conclusions, decisions, including for the independence, for ethical matters, for audit planning, audit completion, and the audit opinion. So whether they would exchange their working papers depends on the internal negotiation between the two auditors for the way, but these documents for press reviews, they have to describe the reviewed documents, and some joint protocols has to be signed for such cross reviews. In addition, each audit file, so each joint audit engagement is a subject of a separate inspection by the Commission, and also each joint audit file is a subject of the internal independent quality review required by our legislation.
Very clear. Jan, what about South Africa on documentation?
Thanks, Chair. So on documentation, or the overall, the principle that we use is that although the work itself, it might be sitting on different electronic files, we view it as one. So the important part is actually the cross review that will have evidence here to show that I looked at another file. That's indicative of that the whole entire file has been looked at. So that's the main principle. In terms of the mechanics, so the audit file in the context of the joint audit engagement consists of each joint auditor's documentation relating to their agreed allocated audit work and the documented evidence of the cross review. Collectively, the joint auditor's documentation forms the audit file. It is not expected that all joint auditors would retain a copy of all engagement documentation. So we don't expect you to copy what's sitting in the other joint auditor's file and put it in your file as well. No? We see both of them together as the entire joint audit file. Okay. However, the joint auditors are allowed to agree to, if they can, to have a single audit file or electronic file if they're able to do it. But it's not a requirement. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. Marjolaine, I think in France is very similar.
Yeah, I think Jan has covered quite well the situation. Indeed, the provisions on documentation apply to the college, so the file should be in the end complete, taking both parts of it. And in addition, of course, each joint auditor should document the cross review that he has performed and the key elements allowing him to form also his opinion. So the idea is really that in the file of each joint auditor, there are the elements supporting the opinion that will be delivered in the end. But the idea is not to have a full duplication of the files, but appropriate documentation. And there is one specific provision in the joint audit standard to explain indeed that the supporting documentation shall be retained by each auditor.
Last topic before questions. It's communication with management. It's something we've addressed, during the discussion. We've, addressed from time to time this question. But just just to summarize, how is the communication organized with management and with the audit committee, I should say? Is it always a joint presentation by the auditors, the joint discussion, or can we imagine that the auditors talk individually, to management, to audit committee on certain topics relating to the joint audit? Jan, maybe?
Thank you, Chair. In the South African environment, our guidance suggests that the auditors must do it jointly. So all communication to management must happen jointly. All communication with the audit committee must happen jointly. You can have a scenario, obviously, because one has audited the work and the other one has cross-reviewed. So the one who did the actual audit work will then do the drafting of the document, and the other one will just ensure that he's aware of it, and when it's presented, he's present. Because then that keeps the principle of a joint audit engagement. Thanks, Chair.
Very clear. Valia?
Well, our guidelines envisage for the entire communication between the joint auditors and the management, and the communication between the joint auditors and the audit committee to be performed jointly. So it means that all letters, all reports has to be prepared and signed and presented jointly.
Yeah.
That's the role.
I think it's the same principle that is applicable in France also. The requirement for communication with those charged with governments. So also with the audit committee and with management, are done together by both auditors. So that's really the idea, that the two works as a college, and that the provisions of the standard with regard to communication apply for both auditors together. That's the principle.
Patrick, I think we've got a few minutes for questions, if any. Need for precisions.
I think we've been very clear. We have no questions.
Maybe very clear.
I think.
Thank you very much, Valia. Thank you very much, Jan. Very clear. I think it was very demonstrative presentation, very interesting and very interesting. I think we've seen a lot of similarities, between the three countries. It's not exactly the same. Probably there are more similarities between Bulgaria and France than with South Africa, but I think Valia explained why. And I think also what is important, the three of you use the term, it's working as a college, a team, the joint auditors. It's not 1+1, it's really two auditors working together. And that's probably the main message that we can draw, from this session. Okay, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan and Valia. And also thank you, Marjolaine and Mr. Etévenin. As planned, we have a coffee break that is awaiting you, and we will come back in this room at 11:15.